Just one team today on Friday, no double dip, mostly because my sinuses are all discombobulated. So we're just going to go real heavy into one team today. We're not going to overdo it. I don't have to overdo it. It's July 26th. Although, again, if Yahoo Leagues really do open on August 8th, well, then we're going to start overdoing it at that point. So expect a lot of overdoing it. This is Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. Welcome to the show. I'm Dan Besbris, your daily host here on your fantasy basketball fix. Old Man Squad on Twitter. Old Man Squad. All one word on Twitter. I'm at Dan Besbris as well. Old Man Squad, by the way, will follow you back. You guys knew that already. No one's surprised by this news. Please take a moment here at the front end of the show to like, rate, and subscribe before you guys tune me out partway through or float off, do something else. That's your call to action on today's program. We don't have any sponsors yet, but we will. And when we do, then I'll probably not bother you as much about the liking and the rating and the subscribering. But for now, that's the stuff that needs to happen. Memphis Grizzlies is the only team we're covering on today's show. I figured if we're going to do one, we got to make it a doozy. And Memphis is a damn doozy because the Grizzlies had plenty of viable players on their team last year, and then they didn't. Morant, remember, started the season serving a 25-game suspension. He came back, played in 9 games before an injury knocked him out for the rest of the year. Desmond Bane only made it through 42. He was banged up throughout the season. Large size injury that knocked him out for almost 2 months. Marcus Smart played basically the first 20 ball games. I think he came back for like 2 games in there and then was hurt again. He didn't make it through the year. And so you got this Grizzlies zombie lineup that was, for most of the season, Jaren Jackson Jr. and, Scooby-Doo sound effect. Or Tim Allen. Scooby-Doo, Tim Allen. I don't know. Home Improvement reference early in today's podcast. That's a weird one. You can check that off the board. Now, in terms of what these players did last year, we can derive some kind of information from it, but there's a lot of look ahead with the Grizzlies. Let's start with Morant because he's effectively the team superstar, even if he's not going to be the highest ranked player in 9 category leagues. And played in only 9 games last season, averaging 25 points, 5.5 boards, 8 assists, 0.8 steals, 0.6 blocks. He shot 47% from the field and 81% at the free throw line with 1.6 3-pointers. It was the definition of a small sample size, but there were a few things that if you kind of dive into the numbers a little bit more, that were a little bit different for last year. The big one was, and again, this could be the magic of small sample size, he shot 81% at the foul line in his 9 ball games after being, throughout his career, closer to 75%. Morant is the prototypical guy who's much better in real life than he is in 9 category fantasy leagues. One of the big reasons for that was because he was more of a punt free throw type of target. It's not the only hole in his game. He doesn't shoot that many 3-pointers for sort of a prolific volume scorer. The assists were much better at 8. That's an improvement for him. Obviously, the rebounds being in the 5s instead of the 4s. That's an improvement. Steals and blocks is generally not a big thing for either. He's hovered around that kind of 1.4 range most seasons in his career. 1.2, 1.1, 1.6, 1.4, 1.4 again. So there's some things with that are always going to be very difficult to unlock, meaning the defensive stats, the 3-pointers. I don't know that those are going to take a massive step forward. But if we could somehow, and we can't, by the way, spoiler, we can't know if the free throw thing is actually going to hold. If it did, that's how he takes a large step forward. And you could see it because this last year he was number 56 in 9 category leagues, where a lot of the other stuff, the peripheral things, not peripheral, the everything else, I guess we should say, was not all that different than prior years where tends to fall down to that 80, 90, 100 range because he takes so many free throws and has so many turnovers. He becomes more of a punt guy. This last season in again, albeit 9 ball games, he wasn't a punt dude. Am I willing to take a shot that that's a thing that carries over? No. The reason I say no is because it's going to cost a pretty penny on draft night to get him on your team. It's not like John Morant is somewhere where people are like, oh, yeah, John Morant, he's always in the 90 to 100 range, so that's where I'm going to draft him. Everybody is always looking at Ja going, okay, well, I have a punt free throw team, so bingo bango, or I'm punting turnovers, so bingo bango, or I'm in a date category league, or I'm in a points league, or I think Ja's about to take another giant step forward. There's, I don't know how many I just said, 5 or 6 different reasons why his ADP doesn't generally match what he did the year before. So if you want John Morant, you're going to have to pay up. I guess the point I'm actually trying to make here in talking about Morant is not that he's a guy I'm out there attempting to draft repeatedly or whatever, but rather maybe this is a year where I'm less against drafting him at all. Because last year, there was no way. There was a 0% chance I was going to draft a guy who was out for the first 25 games of the year outside of like a keeper league where you could squat on him for a while. No chance. This year, little chance. And he'll probably get drafted in the 50s or something like that, which is going to max him out in 9-cat. But it's no longer the worst idea in the world because now you see this just very slight, almost imperceptible outline of a possible 9-category step forward. I probably wouldn't draft him in 9-cat until you got to around pick 70. He's not going to get that far. I'm aware of that, so I probably end up with 0 John Morants on my fantasy team, but I'm not going to chastise you quite as much if you do. Because last year, if you ended up with Morant, I was going to yell at you until my face turned blue. That would have driven me crazy. If you were like, oh, yeah, go get the guy who's out for 25 ball games. No. Bad fantasy player. Step it. Reprimand. What about Desmond Bane, who I foolishly had on my board as a guy I thought that was going to stay healthy last year? I mean, talk about a big miss on one part of my handicap. That was it. I thought that last year Bane was going to force himself to play through little nagging injuries to keep the Grizzlies within striking distance for when John Morant came back, but then Ja went right back out, and the team was just like, all right, that's about enough of that. So Bane only played in 42 ball games. He only played in 58 the year before. He's starting to look like a dude who's having some issues staying healthy, although I think you can put a lot of this last season on the Grizzlies kind of throwing in the towel after Ja went down the second time. So let's throw that out for a minute. Let's try instead to say, okay, do we think Bane can get to 70 ball games in a season? I think there's a shot, and I think he'll be trying to play in most games this coming year. So if we use that as part of our handicap, and we understand that his field goal percent is probably going to be in the 47 range, which is pretty darn good for a shooting guard, and he's a high 80s foul shooter, so good percentages. That's important. Makes 3 3-pointers a ball game. Is this an opportunity for a bounce back year on Desmond Bane? As with all things, you kind of have to start the answer to that question with, it depends on what his ADP looks like. He finished at number 34 this past season, 23.7 points per game, 3.3 threes, 4.4 rebounds, 5.5 assists. Yes, I feel like we're playing a game of Yahtzee here. 1 steal, half block, good percentages. Usage that's going to come down, unquestionably, because you'll have Ja around. Bane took 18.5 shots a game this last year. Previous season, when Ja was healthy, he took 16 shots per game, and I think that's probably the number that you see it dial back down to, something in that 16 range. Although Ja missed a bunch of time that year also, not nearly as much. I mean, he missed basically the entire season. So you might actually see Bane go just slightly lower than that year before, but at the same time, a lot of his other stuff was still pretty darn good. Good field goal percent, great free throw Rebounds, assists were fine. Steals, blocks were fine. Nothing spectacular there. 3 3-pointers a game. That kind of dropped him into the late 30s, early 40s range. And I think that's probably about where he gets drafted this coming year. Beginning of the fourth, maybe just call him a fourth rounder. He probably goes in the fourth round. I think there are enough exciting names that didn't miss 40 games last year that'll go inside the first 35, 36, if you want to just go the full 3 rounds there. And so Bane probably goes around 40. I think he's a relatively safe pick around 40 because I do think his floor is 50 this coming season. That's a safe spot to be, and he could push ahead of that if little things tick in his favor. If there's a field goal percent uptick or a free throw percent uptick, the turnovers will likely come down, blah, 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 all these little things that could kind of level off. But more than likely, he finishes around 40 to 45 on a per game basis, and I think he'll have a better shot of staying healthy. So try to get him at 45. If you have to go a couple slots earlier, that's okay. You're probably not going to get the guy that blasts through the ceiling that, maybe there's a guy at 40 that you're looking at going, I think this dude could be top 20. I don't think Bane's going top 20, but he's a relatively safe pick in the 40s this year. Jaren Jackson Jr. totally revamped his fantasy profile for a season with nobody around him. And I think we'd all like to very quickly forget that he completely revamped his fantasy game for this last year because his value went way down. His blocks were cut in half from 3 a game to 1.6, despite playing 4 additional minutes per ball game. Pretty wild, right? Steals went up accordingly. The steals have been on a very linear path according to how many minutes he's playing in a ball game. With the blocks getting cut in half, that was a direct run from him just having to do the offense. And that's awful for the Grizzlies. JJJ is decent on offense, but that's as much as credit as I'm going to give him. He's not a great outside shooter, even though he's chucking up threes. He's 32% this last year. He shot only 50% from 2 this year, which was the second worst mark of his career, generally more like 53 or better. He shot 32% from 3, which is below his career mark. Everything was below because he got stuck with harder shots. He had no help this year. No one was leaving him open even for a second because there was no Ja for the whole season, no Bane for half the season. JJJ took 17.5 shots per game this year, which is 4 more than any season in his young career to this point. We need Jaren Jackson back around 13.5 shots per game. That is his sweet spot. That'll get him back down to the more efficient mark between 16 and 19 points per game. That'll get the assists will come down as well because he's not going to have to handle the basketball as much, but presumably the blocks will come back up. I think we can safely say the blocks will tick back in the right direction if he can then focus again a bit more on that side of the equation. You can't guarantee it, but there's a decent probability of that happening. And so it'll come down to where he gets drafted. Now, remember, we were just talking about that mock draft a few days ago with Eric Ong, where JJJ still went in the 30s. I don't want him in the 30s. Even though if the blocks do come back to 2.5 or 3 a ball game, and he gets back to what he was effectively the year before, remember JJJ 2 seasons back, not this most recent one, but the one before that, he was basically on the turn. Forget if he was like 12, 13, 14, something in that range. The 3 blocks per game pushed him all the way up the board. There weren't that many guys that were blocking 3 shots a ball game. In fact, there was only one, no Wemby around. But I guess you could argue there's maybe 1 or 2 additional players now that are putting up massive block numbers, so maybe they're not quite as valuable. But that drop off from 1.6 or from 3 to 1.6 was really pronounced. I mean, we're talking about a guy, JJJ, 2 seasons back when he was averaging 3 blocks a ball game. Think of it from the totals standpoint. He played in 63 games that year, which, mind you, not all that far off the 66 he played in this last season. By totals, he went from about 190 blocks down to this past season, down to like 100. We could pull up the totals and I could get you the actual number. He's a little bit over 100 this year, like barely. But think about it from a roto standpoint. Forget the head-to-head side. What would 100 blocks do to your roto team? If you look at the final standings in your league, that's probably like 6, 7, 8 roto points. If you're wondering why JJJ's value dropped from 12 to 50 something, that's why. It's much easier to visualize why value is calculated the way it is when you think about it more from the roto totals side. Because it's like, okay, what's 100 blocks worth? And I get it when you think about it in the micro sense, like what was 5, 6 blocks in a given week? It doesn't feel like that much. But 100 over a season is a colossal amount. You don't know exactly when they're going to come. You know, it might be 10 in one week and then 0 the next or something like that. And that's why it's harder to visualize this stuff on the head-to-head side. But if you're thinking about like looking at the overall numbers, 100 is huge. I don't know that he gets all the way back to where he was. But I would guess that JJJ gets back into the 2s on the block side. And that would push him up about a round and a half, something like that, depending on, you know, where in the 2s he lands. Is it 2.1 or is it 2.6? These are big differences in his value. I think there's a reasonable chance he could get back inside that 3rd round or higher, but I don't want to pay that price for him after we've seen, you know, this is what it looks like when he's not taking any risks on defense. When he's like, I got to be out there for 35 minutes a game. If we're going to be competitive, I can't get fouls. I would look to try to draft JJJ closer to where he finished this last year, which is near the edge of the top 50. I don't know if he's going to get there. Frankly, it's an ADP and a pre-rank that I'm extraordinarily interested in. And, you know, I mean, if I had to, I would take him in the 40s. But, you know, we've seen the way things look if the bottom falls out. If the usage goes down and the blocks don't come up, then you're looking at a real mess. So there's a lot of risk here with JJJ, more, I think, than like his teammate Bane, who we just talked about. And it's going to come down to, you know, if I have to spend a 4th round pick on him versus a 5th, I know it doesn't seem like much, but in my eyes, it is. First 4 round guys, I don't want to take dudes where the floor could fall out. I'm much more interested in taking high floor dudes with my first 3 or 4 picks, because we've talked about this before. You can't really win your fantasy league with your 2nd round pick. You can't, but you can lose it. 3rd is a little more iffy. 4th, like, I guess you could potentially, like, if you ended up with Shea 2 years ago, or I don't know, Holmgren this last year or something like that, it does a lot, certainly, to help you win your league. But I'm pretty sure I would still argue that it's not going to win you your league. Having the best 4th round pick gets you a really good landing spot. You know, Shea 2 years ago being the best example of that. 4th rounder who ends up a 1st. But he was a weird case where everybody thought he was injured and then he wasn't. As much as, say, you know, drafting a bad 2nd rounder like Michael Porter Jr. a couple years ago, where he played like 4 games poorly and then missed the whole season with a back injury, that kills your fantasy team. It's a death knell. A couple more names I want to talk about on the Grizzlies, so I don't want to get too locked in here on JJJ. One of them is Marcus Smart, who played in only 20 games this last year. I thought I would take a shot on him in a few leagues, and the steals went the way I hoped they would, which was 2.1. But the turnovers were absurdly high, and he kind of forgot how to shoot free throws after mostly fixing that over the previous couple of seasons in Boston. The other stuff wasn't all that far off from kind of where we expected, hoped, whatever you wanted to call it. At 4.3 assists, he scored more because Ja was out. He hit 2 3-pointers a ball game. That stuff was all proper, but I guess the free throw was good for a few years, and then it actually fell off his last season in Boston again. He managed to correct it between 2018 and 2022, and then the last 2 years it dropped back off again. The field goal percent was actually higher than previous seasons. So, I mean, by all accounts, that was kind of a win. The steals were extraordinarily high. The turnovers really was the kind of the ugly thing on Marcus Smart. And yeah, those are going to come down. There's no question about it. I am surprised that he only had 4.3 assists per game this year. It seemed like that was going to be something that had to be higher because he was kind of, I don't say alone, but it was like Smart, Bane, and JJJ, and then other, as opposed to in Boston where there were a bunch of other guys around him, but his assists dropped off precipitously. So I don't really know what to make of Marcus Smart going into this season, but you slot Ja Morant back in there, and I would have to assume, this again is we're sort of doing it fuzzy math style, that he's going to just do less. 12 shots a game this year is the most he's taken in his NBA career. His last season in Boston was at 9.9. That's probably a more reasonable target with Ja coming back. 11.5 points. Do I think he gets to 6.3 assists? I don't. Does he hit 2 3-pointers a game? Nah, I'm going to go with no. Let's say, I mean, maybe he'll get close. 1.8, 1.9, something like that is within striking distance. The rebounds are not going to be very good. The steals is where there's a chance to hold on to value. And then again, with the turnovers improving, I don't know how Marcus Smart really pushes himself inside the top 100. That feels like a difficult path, road to hoe, as it were. Still, if you get 2 steals per game out of somebody, there's kind of a spot for them on your fantasy team. I just don't know that I could see him going any higher than like 90. That feels like a best case scenario for Smart. And is that worth spending a late flyer type pick on when you know the best case is an 8th round value? Depends, I guess, a little bit on what the rest of your fantasy team looks like. If you have an extraordinarily risky team and you're like, look, I just need to get steals and I can't take any more chances. I need to have a guy that I know I can play, even if he's, rolling top 120, 130 range. Okay. But I think when it gets to like pick 110, which is probably around where Smart ends up getting drafted this year, I'd rather go for somebody that I think could get to the 60s. Just someone that has any kind of upside to tap into. And with Smart, there just kind of isn't. Because we saw what the upside should have been this last year with no Ja around, and he still couldn't crack the top 100. Mind you, turnovers were a big part of that. If you were an 8 cat, he was significantly better. But good Lord, 4.3 assists and 3.1 turnovers is an atrocious ratio. That's just not even remotely close to good enough. So Smart's probably not a guy that I'm targeting this year. Everybody has a price tag. If it's a deeper league, okay. But 12 teamers, I don't know that you could convince me to take him any earlier than about pick 140. Then at that point, he's probably off the board and just go do something more interesting and fun around him. And now we get to the last big question mark on the Grizzlies. And this is one that remains somewhat unanswered. And that question mark is, who the hell is the 5th guy, or is there even one? Grizzlies have a number of players that all have some kind of claim to the 5th spot, whatever you want to call it. Because Bane and JJJ and Ja and Smart are going to play starters minutes. We know that. Give them all something in the 30s. Bane played 34 last year. Ja played 35. JJJ 32. Smart was 30. Even if you just average it out and call it like 31, 32 apiece for 5 of them, that knocks out about 155 of the 240 minutes available. And if you round up to 160, you're leaving just 80 minutes left. And the Grizzlies have all these bodies. Santi Aldama, Brandon Clarke is an interesting one. Gigi Jackson, young guy that got some run. Vince Williams Jr., Jake LaRavia. How do these get split up? I mean, if you talk about 4 players, you're already down into the low 20s if they split it evenly. My hope is that Brandon Clarke becomes that last guy. That doesn't necessarily mean that Brandon Clarke is going to start. In fact, I don't think he does. I think the Riz would rather just have more spacing and play Jaren Jackson at the 5, meaning someone like Aldama or Conchar is probably the guy that slots in there. But if Clarke can get, like 23, 24 minutes a ball game, he actually has a shot to hit top 100 range. And the funny thing is, too, here, Clarke only played 6 games during the regular season this past year. His numbers were actually pretty freaking good. And I don't know if anybody noticed it, because Brandon Clarke shot 14% at the free throw line. Yeah, not 40, 14. It was a very small sample size, mind you. I think he made like 1 out of 7 free throws in 6 ball games. But it was a pretty significant counterweight on his fantasy value. Like, even if the volume is extraordinarily low, if you just go to the free throw line once a game and miss it, that's really quite bad for a fantasy team. Yeah, 14%. That's ridiculous. However, the other stuff for Clarke was surprisingly good for a guy coming back from a massive, massive injury. He scored 11 points per game in those 6 ball games. He had 5 rebounds, 1.5 assists, 0.8 steals, and 1 block. It is eerily reminiscent of Clarke's first couple of years in Memphis, when it seemed like he was kind of on the way up before the Grizzlies were like, no. This is going to be Santi Aldama's team now. And I mean, I'm looking at like 2020 to 2021, the 72 gamer. He played 24 minutes a game that year, averaged 10 and 5.5 with a steal and a block on only 52% shooting, which is pretty weird, but 69% at the foul line. And he's basically been a 70%er at the free throw line when he doesn't have the yips. Following year, he actually got some votes for 6th man of the year. He averaged 10 and 5.5 with 0.6 steals and 1.1 blocks, and shot 64% from the field. And then last year, he was at 66% in 19.5 minutes per game before going down with the injury. He was only at 1.3 combined defensive stats last season. That's the number that needs to be higher if we really want him to hit any kind of fantasy value. But we got this little glimpse. Could Brandon Clarke take 8 and some odd shots per game this year and average 11 and 5 with almost 2 defensive stats on great field goal percent? It's kind of an outside shot sort of thing. It's more of a hope than an expectation. So I know we're talking about him, but he's the reason we're talking about it is because he's the only guy on this list of who could be the other guy that has the fantasy profile to succeed with limited minutes. Aldama needs 30 minutes a game and a lot of shots. Conchar needs 30 some odd minutes a game. He doesn't need any shots, but he just needs to be out there forever. Luke Kennard, I believe, has a team option for 15 mil. So I still don't even know if he's going to be back in Memphis. And then I don't think the young guys are going to soak up that much playing time. So if you're looking at like who could maybe have fantasy value in 20 some odd minutes, the only name from all of those players that we just rattled off that could is Brandon Clarke. Will he? Odds are no. I give it like a 15% chance that it actually locks in. But still, 11 points, 5.5 boards, and 1.8 to 2 defensive stats. If he was shooting 70% at the foul line instead of 14, I say again, that would put him right in that top 100, top 115 kind of range. Which, again, not exciting, but considering he's almost definitely going to be on the waiver wire to start the year, maybe just call him a watch list guy. How's that? That feels more fair. You definitely don't need to pick up or draft Brandon Clarke. Definitely not. But if it looks like he's going to get to play 23 or 24 minutes, then I'd say throw him on the end of your bench. The rest of these guys, they all need more. Every other dude on this team that's not one of the main cogs needs 30 minutes or more to post fantasy value. And even the main cogs, like Marcus Smart, probably needs 34 minutes to post fantasy value. But JJJ, Desmond Bane, they don't. But that's not who we're talking about here. We're talking about everybody besides the core 4 who could maybe be a 12-teamer for some stretch of time with 23, 24 minutes a game. The only player on that roster that has a shot to do it is Brandon Clarke. So watch list him. And then in terms of the other main dudes, Marcus Smart, I don't think I really want him. I would draft him at 140. John Morant, I think he has a shot to be a little bit better. He's had all this time off to maybe work on his free throw shooting or three-point shooting. I don't know if it's going to land or not, but I would probably take him at 70 and 9-cat. JJJ, I'd like to get him in the late 40s if at all possible. Desmond Bane, I'd like to get anywhere in the 4th round. Obviously, the later the better. And that's where I land on the Grizzlies as of right now. Coming up on Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball, next week should be a really fun one. We're going to try to do at least 8 teams as we continue our run through the NBA. We are now, I think, we're 12 done. Is that right? Have we done 12? If we can get through 8 next week, that would only leave 10 to try to squeeze in before Yahoo League's open. Yeah, I guess it's a tall order, but I think we can probably get there. I also would like to do a Dan Besbris's way too early top 12 at some point in the next week. So that maybe will be coming up. We'll talk to get some guests, see if we can get them lined up for next week as well. Should be a lot of fun. Kind of a weird one, actually, for me to leave dangling over the weekend. Just a Grizzlies preview, but whatever. That's just the way the schedule rolled itself out. Thank you once again for making the Rhett Bauer episode from last Friday the most listened to episode in the brief history of Old Man Squad fantasy basketball. I'm extraordinarily grateful. Please continue to like, rate, and subscribe. Let me know your thoughts on the Grizzlies. I don't know if you guys agree that this is a team where there may be a couple of small values mixed in there, but it'll depend again on where Bane and JJJ in particular are getting drafted. I can't wait. I'm operating on the assumption that August 8th is going to be Yahoo Day. We are now then officially under 2 weeks away from that moment. Oh, baby, that's the count up instead of the count down once we get there. I'm Dan Besbris on Twitter. The network is Old Man Squad on Twitter. Follow that one so you get updates. That's where all my episodes are being posted, whether it's YouTube or iTunes, Spotify, whatever. That all is going out from the Old Man Squad network. I try to quote tweet that from my own account at some point later on in the day. But if you want the first, like that quick initial update, Old Man Squad at Dan Besbris, make sure to follow both, and that'll get you to the finish line. Thanks for listening all week long, everybody. The continued ramp up is upon us. Have a great weekend. I'll be dealing with, I shouldn't say dealing with, it's been so much fun. Last baseball all-star tournament for my older kiddo, meaning starting the following, well, no, I think we're out of town the following weekend. But after that, I will be back sometimes in front of my computer on weekends again. Last 2 months, I've basically just been gone, Saturdays and Sundays. Olympics have also begun. The Olympics start this weekend as well, or today. I was thinking basketball starts this weekend. The Olympics actually start today, so flick that on in the background. We can have a lovely Friday all together. See you guys on Monday. So long for now.